Picture the Palatine Hill on a scorching afternoon in 220 CE. You're pressed against the cool marble of a colonnade, watching as a procession unlike anything Rome has ever witnessed makes its way through the Forum. The air shimmers with heat, but it's not just the Mediterranean sun that's making people sweat. There's something else, something that makes your breath catch and your pulse quicken with a mixture of fascination and dread. At the center of the procession rides a figure that defies every category your Roman mind has been trained to recognize. Sometimes draped in the purple toga of a Caesar, sometimes adorned in flowing Syrian silks that catch the light like water, the 14-year-old Emperor Elagabalus moves through his capital like a living contradiction. Behind him, priests carry a massive black stone, a meteorite from the Syrian desert that the boy emperor insists contains the essence of the sun god himself. The crowd doesn't know whether to cheer or flee. Before we journey deeper into one of history's most controversial reigns, I'd love to hear from you. If you're finding value in these explorations of the ancient world's hidden complexities, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And please drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me that we're all here, scattered across continents and time zones, united by our curiosity about the same vanished emperor who scandalized Rome 2 millennia ago. You watch as a Praetorian guardsman shifts uncomfortably, his hand tight on his gladius, his face a mask of professional neutrality that doesn't quite hide the confusion beneath. Because this is the paradox that will define the next 4 years of Roman history. The most powerful person in the known world is also the most incomprehensible. A teenager who seems determined to use absolute authority not to preserve tradition, but to shatter it completely. The question isn't whether Rome can survive such an emperor. The question is whether Rome can survive what he reveals about the empire itself, about the fragility of its certainties and the thin veneer of its masculine order. To understand how Rome found itself ruled by a child who would challenge every assumption about power, gender, and divinity, we must first understand the world that produced him. The Severan dynasty, which had governed the empire since 193 CE, had always been different from the old senatorial families who claimed descent from republican heroes. The Severans were North African, cosmopolitan, comfortable with the empire's eastern territories in ways that made traditional Romans uneasy. They married Syrian noblewomen, patronized foreign cults, and understood that Rome was no longer just a city ruling provinces, it was the administrative center of a genuinely multicultural civilization. When Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 CE by his own Praetorian prefect Macrinus, the networks of Syrian women who had grown accustomed to proximity to power saw their influence threatened. Julia Maesa, sister of the late Empress Julia Domna, was not content to fade into wealthy obscurity. She had 2 grandsons, and in her villa at Emesa, surrounded by the great temple of the sun god Elagabalus, she began to plot a restoration that would reshape the empire forever. Her eldest grandson was known then as Varius Avitus Bassianus, a boy raised in the shadow of that temple, trained in its ecstatic rites, accustomed to seeing priests and sacred prostitutes blur the boundaries between male and female, human and divine, mortal and eternal. The cults of the Syrian desert operated according to different logics than Roman state religion. Where Roman worship was contractual and transactional, Eastern mysticism was transformative and ecstatic. Where Roman ritual reinforced social boundaries, Syrian ceremony dissolved them. Julia Maesa's gambit was audacious to the point of madness. She began spreading the rumor that young Varius was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son, born of a liaison with his own sister. It was a lie so scandalous it gained credibility through sheer nerve. In May 218 CE, she brought the boy before the 3rd Legion, stationed near Emesa, and declared him the rightful emperor. She renamed him Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, linking him to both the beloved philosopher-emperor and the recently murdered Caracalla. The scale of what followed shocked even those familiar with Rome's periodic civil wars. The legions didn't just accept the boy, they embraced him with religious fervor, because Julia Mesa had given them something more than just another claimant to the purple. She had given them a living god. The soldiers knelt before Elagabalus, the name they gave him, taken from his deity, and when they rose, they were no longer just mercenaries backing another strongman. They were converts to a new imperial cult that promised to remake Rome itself. Within 3 months, Emperor Macrinus was dead, his armies having defected en masse to the teenage mystic who promised them not just better pay, but cosmic transformation. They could not look away. Even those who wanted to resist found themselves drawn into the orbit of this strange new authority that seemed to operate according to rules no Roman had encountered before. The boy, who claimed to be simultaneously emperor and god, male and female, Syrian and Roman, was coming to the capital, and he was bringing his black stone meteorite with him. The journey from Syria to Rome took months, and every mile revealed more clearly what the empire had unleashed. Traditional Roman military discipline dissolved into something that looked more like a religious pilgrimage. The boy emperor traveled in a golden chariot, his appearance shifting day by day in ways that left witnesses struggling for vocabulary. Makeup and jewelry, silks and ceremonial vestments, the trappings of priesthood and femininity worn alongside the purple of imperial authority. Soldiers who had spent careers enforcing Roman masculine virtue found themselves protecting an emperor who seemed to embody its opposite. Reports filtering back to Rome grew more alarming with each dispatch. The new emperor danced in public. He performed religious ceremonies that involved acts the messengers struggled to describe in decent Latin. He spoke openly of taking husbands rather than wives, of serving the sun god in ways that required the dissolution of his own masculine identity. The Senate, receiving these reports in their ancient chamber, must have felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. They had survived civil wars and barbarian threats, but they had never confronted anything quite like this. An emperor who wasn't just politically dangerous, but ontologically unprecedented. When Elagabalus finally entered Rome in the summer of 219 CE, the city held its collective breath. They could not look away. The procession that wound through the Forum was part triumph, part religious pageant, part theatrical performance of a kind Rome had never seen. At its center was the black stone of Elagabalus, carried by Syrian priests whose chants echoed off marble facades built to honor Jupiter and Mars. Behind it came the emperor himself, and contemporary observers genuinely couldn't agree on whether they were seeing a man, a woman, or something that transcended such categories entirely. The boy emperor's first acts revealed the scope of his ambitions. This wasn't a conqueror come to loot the treasury and placate the army. This was a revolutionary determined to remake Roman civilization according to a completely different template. Within weeks, he had begun construction of a massive temple to Elagabalus on the Palatine Hill, positioning his Syrian sun god at the literal and metaphorical center of Roman religious life. He announced that the black stone would be married to Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, in a ceremony that blended traditions in ways that made the traditional priesthood physically ill. But it was the emperor's personal presentation that truly shocked the capital. Elagabalus appeared in public wearing what Roman observers called women's clothing, his face painted with cosmetics, his body adorned with jewelry, his movements graceful and deliberately feminine. He didn't hide these choices or present them as disguises. He made them the centerpiece of imperial spectacle, forcing every Roman who saw him to confront questions they had never had to ask before. What made an emperor legitimate? Was it bloodline, military strength, senatorial approval, or divine mandate? And if an emperor claimed divine authority while simultaneously rejecting every norm of masculine presentation, which mattered more, the divinity or the gender? The mechanisms through which Elagabalus attempted his transformation of Rome were as systematic as they were shocking. He didn't just violate taboos in private. He weaponized imperial authority to make transgression mandatory, universal, inescapable. The Senate, that ancient body of aristocratic privilege, found itself summoned to meetings where traditional toga-clad dignity gave way to Syrian religious ceremony. Imagine senators who traced their lineages to the republic's founding, men who had spent lifetimes mastering the subtle arts of Roman political theater, suddenly confronted with an emperor who insisted they witness his marriages, plural, to men whose primary qualifications seemed to be physical beauty. One of these marriages, to a charioteer named Heracles, became particularly notorious. Ancient sources claim that Elagabalus referred to Heracles as his husband and himself as the wife, adopting the submissive role in ways that violated every Roman assumption about power and masculinity. Whether these accounts are accurate or salacious exaggerations by hostile historians is impossible to determine. What matters is that contemporaries found the very idea profoundly destabilizing. An emperor was supposed to penetrate, to dominate, to embody active masculine virtue. An emperor who proclaimed his own passivity seemed to be undermining the metaphorical foundation of imperial authority itself. They could not look away. Even senators who found Elagabalus personally repulsive discovered they couldn't simply ignore him. He controlled the legions, commanded the treasury, and possessed the legal authority to execute anyone who challenged him too openly. So they adapted, some embracing Syrian fashions and Eastern customs, others maintaining icy disapproval while participating in ceremonies they considered blasphemous. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary, having to treat as sacred emperor someone whose every public appearance challenged their deepest assumptions about natural order. The emperor's religious innovations followed a similar pattern of systematic transgression. He didn't just add Elagabal to the Roman pantheon, he attempted to make the Syrian sun god supreme over all other deities. The sacred fire of Vesta, tended by virgin priestesses for centuries, was to be moved to the new temple of Elagabal. The Palladium, the legendary statue of Pallas Athena that Rome had supposedly inherited from Troy, was to be subordinated to the black stone meteorite. Every symbol of Roman religious continuity was to be reimagined, repositioned, made secondary to this foreign god whose cult involved ecstatic practices that most Romans associated with Eastern decadence. Consider the experience of Cilia Concordia, an entirely hypothetical but representative figure, a Vestal virgin sworn to maintain her chastity and tend Rome's sacred flame. For her entire adult life, she has been the embodiment of Roman religious virtue, respected even by emperors, protected by laws that make violating her person a capital crime. Now she receives imperial orders that her flame, her charge, her reason for existence is to be moved to serve a god she's never heard of, tended by priests whose rituals she finds incomprehensible. Does she obey? Does she resist? Either choice means the destruction of everything she understands about divine order and her place within it. The palace itself became a theater of constant transformation. Elagabalus filled the imperial residence with musicians, dancers, actors, and courtiers chosen for their beauty rather than their administrative competence. Banquets stretched for hours, featuring Syrian delicacies and entertainment that shocked Roman sensibilities. The emperor appeared at these events in costumes that changed multiple times per evening, sometimes presenting as masculine authority, sometimes as feminine beauty, sometimes as priestly mediator between human and divine realms. Guests never knew which version of their emperor they would encounter, and that uncertainty itself became a tool of power. How do you plot against someone whose very identity seems fluid, unpredictable, beyond the categories your conspiracies require? But beneath the spectacle lay genuine administrative chaos. Elagabalus appointed favorites to positions of power based on criteria that had nothing to do with competence. The efficient bureaucracy that had kept the empire functioning through multiple crises found itself disrupted by courtiers who understood religious ecstasy better than tax collection. Provincial governors sent desperate messages to Rome asking for clarification of policies that seemed to change with the emperor's moods. The military, always sensitive to signs of weak leadership, began to whisper about discipline and tradition, and the old days when emperors acted like men. The Praetorian Guard, in particular, occupied an impossible position. They had sworn loyalty to the emperor, but their conception of emperorship assumed certain basic characteristics: Roman birth, or at least Romanization, masculine presentation and behavior, respect for military values and hierarchies. Elagabalus embodied none of these qualities, and his behavior seemed calculated to offend military sensibilities. When guardsmen were ordered to protect the emperor during religious ceremonies that involved activities they considered shameful, when they had to watch their commander-in-chief appear in public wearing silks and makeup, their professional discipline warred with their personal revulsion. They could not look away, but neither could they quite believe what they were seeing. One guardsman, let's call him Marcus Rufus Severus, a fictional composite of the type, might have joined the Praetorians during the reign of Caracalla, serving an emperor who was brutal but comprehensible, a soldier's emperor who spoke the language of camps and campaigns. Now Marcus stands outside the emperor's chambers, listening to sounds that make him grip his pilum until his knuckles go white. His entire sense of honor, of masculine virtue, of what it means to serve Rome, is being systematically dismantled by an emperor who treats those very concepts as negotiable, as costumes to be worn or discarded according to divine inspiration or personal whim. By the third year of Elagabalus's reign, the contradictions had become unsustainable. The empire's treasury was being drained by constant religious festivals and palace entertainments. Administrative positions were filled with incompetent favorites. Provinces reported unrest as local populations struggled to understand what was happening in the capital. The Senate, long since reduced to a rubber stamp for imperial decisions, was showing unprecedented signs of coordinated resistance. And the Praetorian Guard, the ultimate arbiters of imperial survival, were openly discussing the unthinkable. Another coup, another murdered emperor, another reset of the political order. Julia Maesa, the grandmother who had orchestrated Elagabalus's rise, watched her creation spiral beyond her control. She had wanted power for her family, influence at the imperial court, perhaps some accommodation of Syrian religious traditions within the Roman system. Instead, she had unleashed a revolution that threatened to consume the empire itself. Her younger grandson, Alexander Severus, was everything Elagabalus was not: conventionally masculine, educated in Roman law and tradition, respectful of senatorial privileges. Julia Maesa began quietly building networks of support for a transition that would restore stability while maintaining her family's grip on power. The night of March 11th, 222 CE began like dozens of nights before it. Palace musicians played Syrian melodies while courtiers gossiped and plotted in equal measure. Elagabalus, now 18 years old, presided over his court with the same mixture of divine confidence and human insecurity that had characterized his entire reign. If he sensed the danger gathering around him, he gave no sign. Perhaps he genuinely believed his divine patron would protect him. Perhaps he had simply stopped caring about consequences. Perhaps, after 4 years of living as a walking paradox, he had exhausted his capacity for vigilance. The Praetorian guards who entered the imperial chambers acted with precision, not impulse. The coup was sanctioned by Julia Maesa, backed by senators and generals who decided the empire's survival required the emperor's death. They found Elagabalus with his mother, Julia Soemias, the woman who had made him emperor. Neither survived. Ancient sources describe the emperor's futile flight, his capture in a latrine, and his brutal death beside his mother. Their bodies were dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber, not buried, but erased. The killing wasn't only political, it was symbolic. Rome was declaring that some boundaries, once crossed, demanded annihilation. Citizens watched the corpses pass a message that order had been restored and the experiment of Elagabalus was finished. Alexander Severus, the new emperor, moved fast to cleanse the empire's memory. The temple of Elagabal was rededicated, Syrian priests dismissed, the sacred black stone sent back to Emesa. Decrees forbade mention of the previous reign's scandals, as if silence could undo what Rome had seen. But memory persisted. The Senate's historians turned Elagabalus into a monster, a warning of what happened when power belonged to the unworthy. Writers like Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta described his sexuality and gender nonconformity in such lurid detail that their outrage seems almost desperate. They needed to believe he was impossible. One haunting story endures, that Elagabalus asked doctors if surgery could make him female. Whether true or invented, the idea alone unsettled Rome. 2 millennia before modern medicine, someone had imagined a body reshaped to match identity and condemned it as unthinkable. Even after his death, the empire couldn't stop retelling his story. Each version exaggerated the decadence, turning him into a symbol of Eastern excess and moral collapse. Yet that obsession reveals unease deeper than scandal, fear of what he represented. For 4 years, the world's most powerful office was held by someone who refused Rome's definitions of gender, divinity, and authority. The empire answered with violence, but it never forgot. The boy, who called himself the sun, burned too brightly, yet the shadows he cast still linger, whispering that even the firmest certainties are only temporary.